think you hate me.
I don't hate you. So what were you going to tell me? You were going to tell me that you swear that you'll never what?
Send any more money out.
And today's date is January the 27th.
If it is that, sure.
That's what it is, January the 27th.
Okay, well, I swear I'm never going to send any more money out.
Great, that's terrific. I'd love to. I hope that happens. I would love that to happen. So when you get these calls from Jamaica, and I saw it on the phone tonight, I happened to see it, and when you see those calls, you should put the phone down.
Okay, but I'm just saying, I swear I'm not going to send any more money out. I think you hate me.
I don't hate you.
So we'll turn to our first panel. I hadn't had a chance for this morning. Mr. Tiller or Mr. Hart, people in the audience have heard me talk before that my introduction to financial exploitation of seniors was an assistant attorney general in the state of Kansas, where someone brought to me a grocery bag full of these scam puzzles and mistakes, and it's how I began to learn as well. So partnership and my interest with your agencies is long held. So we're going to turn to our first panel on financial exploitation. So let me introduce them to you. Paul Smocker is the president of BITS with the Financial Services Roundtable. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
And Paul Greenwood. We've got Paul he's a deputy district attorney, head of the elder abuse prosecutions in San Diego, California.
Good morning.
Welcome. And Erica Wood. Erica is with the American Bar Association, Commission on Law and Aging, where she's a senior attorney. Three people well-versed in financial exploitation. We will, panelists, hear their comments, and then we've set this up so that we can have an opportunity for those of us here to ask them questions. So you might take notes, and we'll hear from all three and then question them as a group if we can. So, Paul, I think we've gone with you.
Okay, thank you. First, good morning, and thank you of the Elder Justice Coordinating Council for providing this opportunity for us to speak on the subject of financial exploitation of older Americans and actions we can collectively take to reduce that exploitation. As Kathy said, my name is Paul Smoser, and I am the president of BITS, which is the Technology Policy Division of the Financial Services Roundtable. The Roundtable and its members are committed to encouraging their employees to comply with high standards of conduct when providing financial advice to customers, including older Americans and their families. Helping ensure a secure financial system and retirement for millions of Americans is central to the mission of the financial services industry. We are all here because we understand the magnitude of this issue. Unfortunately, the threat to elder Americans is only increasing as the population ages, creating a potentially larger pool of victims for financial exploitation. Since many older customers still prefer to conduct transactions in person, financial services employees can often detect older customers' behavior and have the opportunity to react appropriately in the event of financial exploitation. In identifying and reacting to cases of suspected abuse, it is essential for the institutions to work with adult protective services and local law enforcement. To accomplish this, many institutions participate in local and regional task forces composed of those groups. Working with our member institutions, the Roundtable's BITS organization previously released a white paper to help financial institutions and their customers identify and combat elder abuse. In addition, the Roundtable was proud to participate in the 7th Annual World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. Currently, the Roundtable and its members have committed resources to a working group focused on developing a structure for training financial institution staff on elder fraud trends and procedures for reacting to suspected elder financial abuse. This group also hopes to create a broader, sector-wide, consumer-facing training and awareness program for the industry as a whole. In discussing this issue more generally, the group has identified a number of areas where they feel impediments exist to improving prevention, wherein the assistance of the Council's members would be very helpful. I will outline each of these briefly, but my written comments have more detail on each of them. First, an added layer of sophistication to currently robust financial institution protections could be to segregate elder customers' activities to allow special focus on this population. Many financial institutions are concerned, however, that segregating their customer population for this purpose could be interpreted to place them in violation of existing age discrimination laws. Clarification by the appropriate members of permissibility of using age as a specific criteria for monitoring would help solve this issue. Second, there is a current conflict of customer duty in the legal obligations that occur when a customer who has the legal right to conduct business with his or her account wants to make a transaction that appears to involve fraud. A regulation or statute that provides institutions the authority to authorize a protective hold on such specific transactions would be helpful in this space as well. Another substantial yet similar challenge occurs when an individual with a duly executed power of attorney to act on behalf of the elder is suspected of trying to perpetrate fraudulent activity or activity not in the best interest of the elder. Better educational material for those holding powers of attorney, coupled with enhanced criminal penalties for those who abuse their power, could be helpful here. Fourth, financial institutions are sometimes concerned with the liability they or their employees might incur in situations where they suspect and report elder abuse, particularly if it is a situation in which it is ultimately determined that a fraud was not involved. Today, certain states require the reporting of even suspicions of fraud, but that reporting is not uniform on a national level, and statutory hold harmless provisions to protect the reporter seem far from consistent. Standardizing reporting and liability protections, we believe, would serve to enhance the reporting effort. Fifth, institutions currently file suspicious activity reports to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, but state requirements differ greatly. It is necessary to clarify and standardize as appropriate these reporting requirements. Improvements could also be made to the suspicious activity report process to identify more quickly elder-involved abuse. In addition, sharing the information of various agencies, particularly the CFPB, who is currently collecting information on local and regional APS services, would be very helpful if that could be shared with the industry. Lastly, and Skip mentioned this, an additional area of improvement involves the licensing of financial professionals who serve the community. Our thoughts regarding those improvements were recently submitted to CFPB in response to your request for information regarding senior financial exploitation. In closing, please again accept my thanks for the opportunity to offer our thoughts to you today. Clearly, the concepts and suggestions that we outlined above are a starting point for discussion, and we recognize and wish to work with you as you move forward and appreciate that opportunity to do so. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Smoser, for now and for helping us on the event in June. All very helpful. Paul Greenwood, we'd like to hear from you next.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning. Normally, I'm very comfortable addressing a jury of 12 with a closing argument, but I find today addressing this great council and behind me, sandwiched between some very distinguished colleagues, this is slightly more challenging. But I want to thank you so much for, first of all, giving us the opportunity to meet together as a group. This is really excellent. Sometimes you feel you're on your own and you're battling, going uphill, but to see good faces again and just to be reminded that we're all in it together is very helpful. So I want to thank you just for that in itself. The networking is just terrific. I've had the privilege of prosecuting crimes committed against seniors for the last 17 years. I'm one of two county prosecutors that's on your panels today, along with Paige from Seattle. And it really is a privilege to address you on behalf of many other prosecutors around the country. When I started 17 years ago, there were very few prosecutors dedicated to, on the local level, prosecuting these crimes. But I'm pleased to tell you that the group is growing. And we're all learning so much from the cases that we put on in court. People ask me all the time, how come you stuck in this for 17 years? Well, the major reason is my parents. My father's 90. He has advanced Alzheimer's. He's a Second World War bomber pilot. And my mother's 89. And they are truly my heroes. And they're the people that really keep me focused on why we need to seek justice for these men and women. And, you know, day to day, and for example, tomorrow I travel plans permitting tonight, I'll be in court tomorrow morning at 8:30 on a typical caregiver theft case. And we do those regularly. But where I've become frustrated over the last 17 years is our inability to apprehend these crooks that you've seen on video who perpetrate scams against our elders. And they range from the grandma scam, and you all are familiar with that one, where the perpetrator calls up, pretends to be the grandson, he's in an out-of-state jail, he needs $5,000 bail money to get him out of jail. And this happens constantly. And then we've got obviously the sweepstakes scams that go on all the time. We've now got, recently I've had several timeshare sales scams where elders are trying to divest themselves of these timeshares and are being ripped off by out-of-state crooks. And these crooks hide behind anonymity, they have cell phones, it's so hard to track, and they always cause a loss of about $5,000. And the problem that I've had over the last 17 years is that we've been unable to coordinate efforts on the federal level and on local level to actually go after these crooks. I'm proud that my office is willing to extradite crooks from out of state and out of country, even for $5,000. If I can probably commit to getting a judge to send that predator to state prison, my office will probably extradite from out of state, certainly, and out of country, hopefully. So what I am here to ask you about is whether we can do more together to coordinate these efforts. And I applaud the federal agencies for what they've done, for the awareness level, but there is so much more, as we all recognize, that we can do together. And one of the major areas well, I see 5 major areas, actually, that I would like to address as being things that we could remedy. Number 1, I would love to see, in major urban areas like San Diego, the creation of a multidisciplinary task force involving the U.S. Postal Service, the U.S. Attorney's Office, local law enforcement, financial institutions, and, of course, MoneyGram and Western Union. And in addition to that, there's one other agency that has cropped up in the last few weeks in my cases that I'm prosecuting. We're seeing a lot of now victimization where the victims are being asked to go to Walmart and CVS to buy prepaid Green Dot cards. Because the crooks have figured out that Western Union and MoneyGram are doing a little bit better now in trying to screen out the wire transfers. But these prepaid cards you buy for $500, and then you scratch out on the back, just like an iTunes card, and there's 14 digits. And all you have to do is give those 14 digits to the crook over the phone, and he's got the money, and he's got it like that instantly. So I'd love to see the creation in major cities across this country developing these task forces to provide some kind of rapid response. Because here's my frustration. I get calls every week from Adult Protective Services. Paul, here's the latest victim. Can you talk to her or him? I talk to them on the phone. They give me phone numbers. They give me wire transfer details of their losses. But then I ask them to make a police report. The police say, well, talk to the FBI. The FBI, unfortunately, I understand why. They say, well, it's a $5,000 loss. There's nothing we can do for you. So these cases go uninvestigated. So the second thing I would recommend is looking at the implementation of mandated reporting laws for financial institutions. California has led the way, I believe, in making bank tellers, credit union tellers, mandated reporters. We've seen a tremendous improvement in the response. And even if all states won't go that far, at least make it mandatory training for all financial institutions so that when an elderly widow comes into the branch and says, can I have $5,000 in cash, it should immediately send alarm bells ringing for the teller that maybe there's a scam going on. Thirdly, I would urge some kind of better stringent anti-fraud measures to be placed out there. For example, it's so frustrating when banks and credit unions get rid of their bank surveillance videotapes after 3 months. Couldn't we ask them to keep those bank surveillance tapes for at least 9 months and maybe secure some kind of evidence there? We need better regulations when a recipient goes in to pick up the money. Can't we mandate fingerprints and photographs and driver's licenses so that we can at least track who it is who's picking up this money? Fourthly, I would love to see the establishment of a national committee of law enforcement experts creating a database which could be accessed by people like and Paige Ulray, containing contact information as to who we could call in other countries or in this country, Canada, Jamaica, the United Kingdom, other countries where scams originate. It would be terrific to have that kind of resource available so that we could, as part of the rapid response team, pick up the phone and say, okay, can you help me here? And fifthly, I would urge for some kind of creation of a system that would allow search warrants to be processed quickly to identify known telephone numbers that are being used by the scammer. I have in my office back in San Diego a whole list of phone numbers that I've called in Jamaica and in Las Vegas, area code 702, area code 876. I've spoken to these crooks, and I have their phone numbers, but I can't do anything about it. And it's so frustrating when you actually talk to the crooks on the phone and they laugh at you. Most of the time I call myself Richard Chamberlain. I don't know why. I grew up with Dr. Kildare. But occasionally my cover has been blown and they find out that I am Paul Green with a deputy DA in San Diego, and they laugh at me. And they just think, because they know that they can just get away with it. So I offer those 5 suggestions, but I want to thank you for the coalitions that have already been formed on the federal level. We need to share success stories amongst us county folks much more, but learn from one another and hopefully coordinate so that we can go after these predators out of state and out of country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Erica Wood. It's baseball season, so I'm going to say batting cleanup. This panel is Erica Wood.
Well, and as long as we're bragging about parents, my mother became 100 last month.
Oh. Wow, that's cool.
So far, she's safe and sound, and I hope she remains that way. I'm from the American Bar Association, Commission on Law and Aging, but today I'm not representing the ABA. I'm honored to be here to talk about the representative payment programs, and I'd like to especially address Commissioner Astru, and I guess that Dr. Petzel is...
I think we do... Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So
I'll fill him in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do we have staff here from the VA, though, I think, too? So, I mean, most of the agencies that are here on the front also have staff, so... Well.
Thank you, and I want to recognize and congratulate everything that you've done and build on your remarks. I'm particularly excited about the Philadelphia demonstration program that you mentioned involving the use of outside information, and I think that's just the kind of thing that I want to, as I said, build on. But despite all that, sadly, some government representative payees do take advantage of their position of trust. Now, I'm talking about rep payees who out and out use benefit funds for their own purposes. I'm talking about payees with direct conflicts as long-term care providers or employers who pay minimum wages or house people in unsafe settings. I'm talking about payees who take control of beneficiary money beyond just the benefits. Payees who no longer have care of the beneficiaries but continue to get and use the money anyway. Problems I know that you're all very familiar with. Payees who commingle benefit funds with other funds or charge excessive or illegal fees. So the payees that we're talking about are in the Mammoth Social Security Program, in the VA Fiduciary Program, OPM, Railroad Retirement, Treasury, and perhaps there are others that we don't, that haven't even surfaced. Such payees play dual roles. So as far as financial exploitation, first, payees stand as a bulwark against financial exploitation. That's why they're there. That's why they were appointed. To manage the funds and protect the beneficiaries. But sadly, they sometimes do become the perpetrators despite their fiduciary role. Now, proportionately, we're only talking about a small percentage. It's a small percentage. But oftentimes, exploitation goes undetected with devastating impact on lives, or we think it's a small percentage. Data is difficult, I think, sometimes to come by. Spurred by the GAO, OIG, and other studies, both Social Security and VA have taken steps in many directions within existing resources in payee screening, selection, support, monitoring, data to better detect abuse, frontline staff procedures, and I certainly defer to them on where these internal actions stand, and obviously more is needed. But I'm really here to open the door to some broader, more holistic strategies that cross agency and jurisdictional lines. Look in a bigger lens where collaboration, coordination is the name of the game. After all, that's why we're here today. One option is simply to get more eyes on payee misuse. Now, folks working in a wide range of federal or federally funded programs and also state players routinely see beneficiaries and might bump into abuse and yet just not recognize it or know what to do about it. Of course, I'm talking about the Aging and Disability Network players like APS, agencies on aging, ombudsman, insurance counselors, long-term care licensing, legal services, but beyond that, think about HUD housing services coordinators, even a postal worker or Department of Labor employee, an RSVP volunteer. The possibilities are endless. Could we somehow open their eyes, heighten their awareness so they know what they're looking for in payee abuse and tell them when and how to report? So that's one. Second, another option is to look at information exchange with external entities. As the GAO pointed out so vividly, the payee programs in Social Security are not coordinated with court programs and with APS, and yet they serve pretty much the same population. A rep payee may also be a guardian, or a person could have two different people, one is guardian and one is rep payee. So essentially, what we've got is two fiduciary systems on top of each other, one federal and one state, but not hooked in, not hooked together. Information on misuse of funds by a payee over here never makes it over here to the court side or to APS, even though it's about the same person. Now, I understand that recent discussions by SSA, the OIG, and the Administration on Community Living are exploring ways to overcome information exchange barriers, and that's very promising. But it's not just sharing information about specific cases. Let's talk systems, coordination, sitting down, breaking down silos among Social Security, the VA, courts, APS, the Aging and Disability Network, which could be a real win-win. What if, at least on a pilot basis, the court and a Social Security field office could join forces on training payees and guardians, could partner in public education campaigns, or even recruit volunteers? What if they sat down, studied trends, problems, egregious cases, miscommunications? What if? And finally, there's an option for greater external payee review. Now, in 2009, as Commissioner Astro knows, in response to a shocking case of longstanding exploitation by payees who had employed individuals with intellectual disabilities in a poultry plant, Social Security contracted to have state protection and advocacy agencies conduct intensive on-site reviews of certain organizational payees. Now, I think this is a twofer because the reviewers can look not only at the funds, but also at beneficiary housing, employment, safety, and care. So one approach could be to extend the P&A program to additional payees, perhaps individual payees, and might explore a similar role for experienced advocates on the aging side, and could perhaps shine a particular light on the conflicting roles of payees who also provide housing and long-term care. Now, there's more that I could say, and it's in my written statement. I just wanted to add a word about the particular importance of payee education and training and support, and note that the fiduciary guide that Skip mentioned does include rep payees. And with that, I'll stop and open to discussion.
Thank you very much, Erica. Let's thank our panel before we do questions. So thank you all. Commissioner, we'll turn it over to you for questions.
Yeah, let me just respond briefly to Ms. Wood, and then I'll have an actual question. I mean, I think that we're in essential alignment. One of the things that concerns me when I talk, particularly to members of Congress and their staff, is that there's an idyllic view of and a dated view of what a Social Security field office looks like. with the budget cuts and the huge increases in workloads, these are swamped offices, and there are actually very few Americans in the waiting rooms and coming in these days. In part, that's because Treasury's been so successful on our behalf with direct deposit. But I actually do this with members of Congress, and they hate it when I take them into their own field offices and I say, is there anything here that surprises you? And then I count 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, and I say, how many people over the age of 60 do you see in the room? And typically, these days, in an urban office in particular, it's less than 10%. There are usually more children in the waiting room than older Americans, and it's because they're in for authentication and that type of thing. That's a problem. What reason I'm bringing this up is there's this image in many quarters that we have this constant, regular interaction with our retirees, and we don't. And so what's really important, and this is actually going to lead up to my question, is the key interaction we have is when they first come on to the rolls, and sometimes they don't even come into the, I think something like 43% are applying online now. So those initial interactions when people first come on are critically important in terms of any information transfer that we give about avoiding fraud or reporting abuse or anything like that. And so I guess the question is, you all come from different perspectives. The financial industry deals with people analogously. You deal with the problems. The ABA looks at it sort of broadly. Is there any learning from other organizations' experience? If we don't have very many opportunities to interact face-to-face with the people that we're trying to serve, as to what's critically important to get across, and is there anything that we should be saying? Is there a piece of paper that we should be handing to people? Is there a website that we should have up that we should be telling them is going to be there if they ever have a problem? Is there anything in terms of information exchange as people are coming into the system that perhaps we're not doing now that we should be thinking hard about doing?
Yeah, Mr. Smosa.
So, and let me comment in a couple of ways. One of the concerns that I personally have is that, I mentioned in the comments that we still see a lot of elder Americans coming into financial institutions. They still tend to want to do face-to-face branch banking. But I think that's going to diminish over time, too. Ironically, the fact that many of them who used to like to get the check because it was a chance to go out and go to the bank every month, right? That doesn't need to happen for them anymore. So, one of my concerns kind of in a long-term going forward sense is, are we collectively, whether it's an agency that deals with these folks, whether it's the financial services industry, are we going to stop having as many opportunities to do that face-to-face interaction, which always tends to be, I think, a little more effective than trying to do it remotely? The one thing I would react to in your comment is that, yes, I think there is an opportunity to do some education at the point of them first entering the system. The one thing that struck me today as I listened to the members and listened to at least the testimony to date is it seems like a lot of us are trying to focus on this kind of awareness and education piece. And it seems to be different agencies are working on perhaps different aspects of this. And I wonder if there is some way for us to figure out a way to coordinate that, because I don't think the messaging is significantly different. There may be specifics related to, how to handle your Social Security payment. There may be something specific, but I think that the basic cautions and messaging and awareness that we're trying to convey is essentially the same. And my staff sometimes hears me make this analogy that a lot of times we seem to react like a group of 6-year-olds playing soccer, right? Everybody wants to go to the same ball. It's important that we go there. It's important, it's important we're trying to score, but we're all using resources that are precious to us to try and accomplish the same end. So I wonder if there's some way that we can think about collectively a way to kind of create that educational messaging with, maybe some lead agency and the rest of us kind of playing a supportive role in that process. Because, we're about to launch something, CFPB is launching something, USPS is launching something, SSA is thinking of something, Treasury is working on something, and I think we're going to end up with a lot of the same words in a probably different packaging, but we're trying to accomplish the same goal, and it would be great if we could figure out a way to work together to get that done.
Can I ask a question before we leave that?
Yeah, I just want to make sure we come back and have other people can ask this.
But it is this question, and it's something that we are grappling with in the broader context of education. In the particular elderly population, what do we know in terms of what is effective education?
Right.
And really, what are the cohorts of elderly who are being abused, and how confident are we that if we are educating in the form of a document, a website, that we're actually going to be effective? That seems like a first-order question, and I don't know the answer to it.
And I'm not sure I do either. I mean, certainly, speaking for our industry, I don't know that we have access to all the research that suggests, as we heard some of the members say today, as we heard some of the panelists say today, kind of what are the brain effects going on in the elderly, and what might be the more effective approach to getting that message across. I mean, we kind of know the fraud schemes, we know how people are being exploited, and we can put out cautions around doing that, but one of the comments that was made early this morning was, and I don't remember who made it, I apologize, but the comment was essentially one of the first things to go is the ability to differentiate when someone's lying to you. Well, kind of a lot of education that says these are the lies to somebody who may not be able to differentiate it.
So we have a couple of questions. Let me broaden it to Erica and Paul, if you want to kind of weigh in. Commissioner Astor asking about sort of that initial point of entry, Ms. Coley asking about kind of what works, and just sort of make sure we have, and we'll keep it moving, but to make sure the other two have a chance to.
Well, as some of you know, I spend a great deal of time on this, looking at the state guardianship system, and so I see a lot of parallels and differences with the rep payee system. But the reason and that's one reason I keep going back to courts, because I see the similarities, and I think that in getting those, in formulating those messages and getting them out, I think that some collaboration between the courts. I recognize that the field offices are not what they used to be, but maybe then there's more need for them to join forces, and I don't know exactly how that would be done, and I know that each court is different, and probably field offices are very different, and so some kind of pilot that might test that and evaluate that might be worthwhile. The other thing that I just wanted to bring from the guardianship side is that there have been pilots sending out volunteers to monitor guardians. Who knows? It might work on the rep payee side too. That's totally untested, but I just throw it out for what it's worth.
I mean, it is a problem. I mean, with the huge cuts we're facing. I mean, we're looking at possibly 15 to 20 days of furloughs for everyone in the government in these days. Going out into the field broadly for 7 million Americans is going to be very hard, particularly to do it in any kind of thorough way. I guess the other thing I just would want to say, and maybe people can react to this. I mean, it's an unfashionable thing to say, perhaps, but there are some limits to education. I mean, if you think about the videotape from the Postal Service we just saw, my bet is if that woman entered our system between the ages of 62 and 70, we could have transferred a lot of this information, and she would have processed it, and it wouldn't have been a problem. But the problem is, I don't know what age she is now, but clearly there's at least early stages of dementia, and there are limits to education. I mean, we could probably, obviously someone was trying very hard, and it was, no use. And that goes back to the other point that I think one of the biggest problems we have is people like that fall through the cracks. There are people who know that somebody is vulnerable and no longer capable of managing their affairs, and yet there's so many legal and cultural barriers to sharing that information that somebody like the woman in the video is probably not going to have that information communicated so agencies can try to respond and help her. I mean, I would not be stunned if the Postal Service told me that's one of my beneficiaries and she doesn't have a representative payee, even though it's very clear from the video that she's not capable of managing her own finances.
And can I just weigh in?
Go ahead.
A couple of points. I think that's why training the gatekeepers of the money is so important, because that victim on that video, the next day, she withdrew more money to send to Jamaica. Mm-hmm. And as long as we can do a better job at training the tellers who are giving out that money, who see this lady coming in day after day, and these crooks are using other sophisticated methods. I've just had a case where now the crooks out of state is calling up a cab driver and called up my cab driver, not my cab driver, a cab driver to pick up my victim on 6 different occasions to take, because she no longer has a car because she's disabled. See, they're arranging for cabs to take them to the credit union and to withdraw the money. And thankfully, it was a trained credit union teller who spotted this and brought it to the attention of the authorities. Secondly, a conduit for getting all this information together. I mean, there are some wonderful websites out there, but I think you'll hear from her this afternoon, Dr. Laura Mosqueda, who wears so many hats, I can't keep up with it, but she and her colleagues at UC Irvine run this national center, and it really is providing a tremendous resource. So if we could somehow, and I hope she doesn't mind me volunteering her organization for this, as a conduit to bring all these different aspects of training and projects together under this one umbrella of the National Center would be a terrific idea.
So for the rest of you on the panels, we're going to expect you to answer all of the questions that have been asked before you get here, don't you think? So keep track, because this is good follow-up. So good.
We're on the first panel.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's going to get harder as the day goes. Commissioner, do you have more questions before I open this?
No, I
panel?
I think I should share. So.
Secretary Coide, do you have more? Let me come back to you since you had asked and see if you have.
I will know.
Anybody else?
Yeah,
Yes.
please. I feel like we could sit here all week, actually, with just this group and discuss it. I think from a law enforcement angle, we have a lot of work to do. We're all playing catch-up to these emerging crimes. For us, we've experienced the Jamaican lottery scheme is the emerging crime in our realm. I believe Mr. Greenwood could share that same opinion. We actually have someone detailed to Jamaica, which sounds very exotic, but it is truly not. Essentially, it's to generate those relationships with local law enforcement. We have our first case at Justice to extradite. We're waiting to see that happen, but it's one case. What I worry about is the law enforcement officer in the middle of Kansas. They need to be a social worker now. They need to know how to interact with the elderly, educate them, interact with the caregivers. We're doing our catch-up ourselves. With Mr. Smoser's comment, we have to do the same with our window clerks at the post office, because they come in and mail $10,000 via express mail to Jamaica. That is not uncommon. My brother down the table here from FTC, they've done a tremendous job with MoneyGram, the wire transfer companies. There's a recent change with Green Dot we should probably discuss at some point. We're all playing catch-up. Corporate America's playing catch-up on how to stop this misuse of their own products. But this is what we have to do, is talk about it. But I almost think we have 2 tracks, the education track and the law enforcement track. And again, we could be here all week and discuss these.
And if I could
More of a
just...
statement.
Yes,
than a
I was going to say, the comments are completely welcome. Do you have questions, too? Because we want to make sure that they can respond.
So 2 thoughts come to mind. One is, and I mentioned the kind of whole suspicious activity reporting in FinCEN. Mm-hmm. I think there's a very practical thing that could be done easily, which is to kind of update that reporting to very specifically call out elder abuse or suspected elder abuse. Right now, if I'm still correct, that it is a textual entry as opposed to one of the categories of what you're reporting as suspicious activity. So just kind of making it a category so that we could collectively do some analysis that suggests that, maybe this same suspect over here in California is also being victimized by someone in New Jersey, so we can kind of start to gather that data. And to the extent that we can, that is a relatively good and mature process for reporting suspicious financial activity. To the extent that we can get other industry players into that space, whether it's USPS following through it, whether it's Green Dot and some of the others following through it, I think that would be helpful to build the database that Paul was trying to look for, which was that, can we consolidate this information and realize the same criminal actors are many times operating across various jurisdictions? I think that would be a very helpful thing to look into if we could.
Other people on the panel? Skip?
Well, first of all, I wondered, Paul, have you used at all, or have you seen any use of the FAST organizations and bringing together as quickly as possible the effort to get information readily available to prosecutors like yourself? I think that would be very important. This whole idea and what we need more of is this is the engagement of the financial community itself, and having them understand that there are safe harbors so that they are not at risk in the reporting. And certainly for those who are in the lay fiduciary roles, in those fiduciary roles, that they understand the responsibilities that they have to report as well. So it just seems to me that what each one of you are talking about, it represents the kind of coordination that we also need to facilitate.
And Skip mentioned the FAST team, which is an acronym for Financial Abuse Specialist Teams, and there are many of those spreading around the country, and we have them in California. And yes, I've been actively involved in that for the last 17 years. And they do bring to the table, but unfortunately, it's always these sad stories. But ultimately, they look to me for trying to solve it and crack it and investigate and prosecute it, and that's where the frustration comes in. And I think just the fact that I hear that you have a post inspector representative out in Jamaica, I mean, I hopefully you don't mind, I'm going to be asking you for the name and the phone number, because this is great, because this is what we need, is points of contact in all these areas so that I can contact the FBI and then we can contact the U.S. Postal Service. And I don't think it would take much to get on a regional level a series of people in a task force to get this going. And speed is of the essence. If we can do it, and I think you said, one case at a time is fine with me. If we can just do one case next month and then the month after, the word will spread in that predatory community. And I think we can do it that way.
Mr. Harwood, do you have any?
Yeah, thank you. A couple different questions. First, let me just follow up on the comment that Mr. Smusser made regarding coordination. Actually, the Federal Trade Commission has a law enforcement database that receives complaints from both Western Union and MoneyGram, and we make that database available to any law enforcement agency in the United States for free. And anyone who's not aware of it, it's called Consumer Sentinel, and if you're a law enforcement agency and want to gain access, we'd be happy to give it to you. We've been working with Western Union and MoneyGram over the past year to feed all of their consumer complaints into the system, so it's a way now that people can, that the law enforcement can go and compare information. And then, Mr. Green, you mentioned Green Dot. We've actually had similar conversations with Green Dot about whether we can work with their data as well. But I'm curious, maybe all three of you can answer this, but if Western Union, MoneyGram, or Green Dot were sitting here, what sorts of things would you urge them to do in addition to what they could do now or what they are doing now to try to discourage seniors from using any of those three payment systems as a means for transferring money offshore frequently?
Well, I mean, they are doing it now, but as you said, by warning them. But I think a personal contact, just by having somebody at the counter saying, have you been contacted today? Has somebody promised you, or has a grandson told you he's in jail? Just having that personal interaction, which might cause some of these people to hesitate. When I speak to the victims, that's one of the first questions I ask them. Did anybody come up to you and ask you if you needed help and why you were sending the money? And in most of the cases, they said no. And I said, well, if they had said anything to you, would that made you have stop and think? And they said, possibly. And they're not going to say it's going to happen all the time. But I also think, though, that these three agencies should do more to make it more difficult for the recipients to pick up the money. I mean, I remember going to the bank a few years ago with my son. He was like 12 at the time, and he had his first check as a recreational referee at the soccer. And the hoops we had to go through to prove who he was to cash like a $24 check. And I think, how ironic, when we do that for a 12-year-old kid, but when a stranger comes in and picks up $10,000. So I think we should and get more regulations to have fingerprints, photographs, photocopies kept on file, so that when we trace where that money was picked up, at least we have a name and a photograph of somebody who's doing it.
Mr. Harwood?
I want to understand the picked up. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
It was just, I want to understand the picked up point, because if the money is being transferred from loaded at a Walmart, Green Dot, MoneyGram, if it's loaded onto a card, it's coming off via ATM or via point of sale. Say more about what the process would look like in terms of verifying the identity of who is actually taking the cash off.
Yeah, for those recipients who go into actual a Western Union or a MoneyGram to actually physically pick up cash.
Got it.
That was, yeah, obviously, as you say, when they just simply open up a new account, it's not going to be so easy to make that happen.
Sure, no problem. Another question that occurred to me. So it strikes me that a lot of effective law enforcement. Let me ask you another question first. You talked about how helpful it would be to have more access to to subpoenas quickly, so you can check on phone numbers. What would you, if you could do that? What would you do with that information? I mean, I gather you'd like to know who owns that phone number, but what's the next step in that process, as far as you're concerned? Assuming you could get that information, how would you go about? Because a lot of these times these people will be offshore.
Right.
So what's the next step?
So, and a lot of these are. And sorry to focus on Jamaica, but a lot of these are from the 876 area code. Mm-hmm. So now that if we can track down where that number was coming from, then we would obviously contact the Postal Service if they have their representative out there, and then work through them with the local law enforcement in Jamaica to identify who this suspect is. And then once we get that information, and I'm constantly telling the agencies, I'm here, I'm willing to prosecute this crime. You show me who it is, I'll prosecute that person. I think once they get that kind of commitment from a local prosecutor, it will start happening.
Okay. So I actually think some of that may already be happening, and as Mr. Tiller's mentioned and some others have mentioned, there actually is an outlet for you to do that by talking with the folks in Jamaica. It's called Project Jolt, I believe, is the name of it.
Yes, sir.
And it's actually trying to do exactly what you're describing. So we'll make sure you get in touch with that. I think my sense is one of the challenges that many law enforcement agencies face is not just identifying who's perpetrating the scam or fraud offshore, but actually effectively prosecuting them, because they are in fact offshore. Have you had success? You talked about possibly considering extradition. Have you had success with that, trying to get prosecutions where the perpetrators are located offshore?
Not offshore yet, because I haven't been able to identify anybody offshore. We've identified somebody, just extradited somebody from Colorado, but not offshore.
So my third, we should work on that as well, I think, because that's a challenge. We actually, the Department of Justice, I think has actually been our best ally with regard to international prosecutions, but something that we should probably discuss in the future. The third thing I want to about, and maybe I know that this is something that maybe Paige can talk about too. I'm curious about the challenges of dealing with a senior victim when you're actually trying to put somebody on the stand or prosecute somebody.
Oh, I love it. I keep telling my other prosecutors around the country, give me a 100-year-old victim, witness anytime. Do I have to run a rap sheet on the victim? No. They have such credibility with my jurors, and even though they may exhibit signs of cognitive challenges, the fact is that they are a victim of financial exploitation. Jurors get it. This is exactly why this person was targeted. And I often say to my gang prosecutor friends, who would you rather have as your victim? A 100-year-old my victim, or your 17-year-old victim who's a member of the rival gang? So it's absolutely, this is one of the misconceptions that I battle against, is that law enforcement typically think that if you're over 75, you're going to be an ineffective witness in the courtroom. That is not the case. They become so powerful.
I think that view is still widely held. How do we overcome that among law enforcement, that older victims are really not good victims to rely on?
It's people like Paige and I and others can go around and say, bring us these cases, because these victims speak for themselves, and they have such jury appeal. So we just got to get that message out across the country to other prosecutors.
Paul, we're dealing with the same issue with the lotteries in Jamaica, and our IG's been pretty active but pretty frustrated. And I know extradition is viable, and I commend you for being willing to do that. Is it also a viable strategy? I mean, your experience in places like Jamaica, if we supply enough information to Jamaican or similar countries' law enforcement, is it a viable strategy to sidestep extradition and actually get prosecution in the country of origin, or do you think that's not a viable strategy?
No, I'm sure that's workable, given the relationships that are obviously being built by our agencies and with the local law enforcement. Certainly it would be. But again, it's about accountability, whether they would follow through, and we'd like to hear if these are successful prosecutions. So I wouldn't say that we have the exclusive monopoly on how to do these cases. No, not at all. I just welcome any prosecutor in any country being willing to do that.
So let's get Department of Justice in the mix. Julie McAvoy, do you have questions?
I do. Thank you. First of all, thank you for your observations and comments. I think one of the clear takeaways is that we can bring some of the Department of Justice law enforcement components into this discussion, particularly on a task force level. I sense the frustration being told that certain of these cases are too small. Perhaps if we get the right folks in a room, we can look at this as a more global problem and get some attention to it. So thank you for that. I was hoping, Mr. Smoser, you could follow up on your suggestion that it might be appropriate to segregate elderly customers as a focus, and that to do that, the financial industry would be interested in some sort of exemption from the ADA. Could you elaborate a little bit and tell me what you had in mind?
I think the question is, we're not even, with so many institutions, we get the question a lot of time, can we actually do that segregation? I mean, it's for, we think, the right purposes, but institutions are concerned that were they to segregate out that population and say, let me give you some practical examples. So we get a change of address to which a statement is supposed to go, right? A lot of times that confirmation of that change of address might go out via email nowadays. But if we happen to know, if an institution happened to know this was an elderly customer, they might take it the extra step to give them a call or ask them next time they're in the branch or whatever the case may be. Hey, Mr. Smith, did you intend to change your address because, we got this request in, and so, I think a lot of the fraud monitoring kinds of systems that are in place today are very strong, but I think institutions would like the opportunity to think about extra steps they could do germane to this population, but are afraid if they segregate that population that they're going to get in trouble in another way. So just, kind of getting some clarity around whether that's permissible, and if it's not, thinking about how we might make it a way to go.
Good. Okay, thank you.
Do you have other questions right now?
No, thank you.
I have one. I wanted to go back to Paul Greenwood. You talking about the $5,000 loss kind of threshold. Will you talk about the relationship between financial exploitation and other kinds of abuse? I'm concerned that if we measure the loss on a dollar, based on a dollar figure, now I understand prosecutors have to make decisions, and so do APS workers, that we're not fully capturing the nature of the abuse if we're only looking at the finances. So will you talk about what you see as the correlations between financial abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and some of the other kind of problems that we're worried about?
Sure, and actually, you've raised a good point. Let me first also talk about the impact on the victim. To some people, the loss of $1,000 may not be too significant, but to so many of my victims, it is huge. And I've seen so many victims spiral downhill as a result of losing $1,000 or $5,000, and they lose the will to live. So I think generally we have to assess the impact of the crimes on the victims, not just by the monetary amount, but on what it actually means to them in terms of having had a violation of trust or whatever. And secondly, you're right, financial exploitation isn't in a vacuum. It can often be part of a wider picture of power and control. So you get the financial exploitation as part of neglect, where the caregiver is basically depriving the victim and weakening them to the point where now the victim signs over the house, quitclaim deeds, does a reverse mortgage, and they become power of attorney and have total control of the assets. And then, of course, there is so much financial exploitation by sons and nephews and grandsons who are addicted to drugs, alcohol, and gambling, who then resorts to violence after they've stolen the victims money and when the victim confronts them. And so you get the whole picture of neglect, physical exploitation, as well as the financial damage. So that's why I believe prosecutors who handle elder cases shouldn't just be departmentalized into, okay, you're doing fraud cases of elders, because I think we cover all aspects, financial, physical, and neglect, because it is a big picture. And in San Diego, our police department has 6 detectives who do nothing but investigate crimes, but they do both physical and financial, because, as you indicate, there's such an overlap often between the various activities.
I mean, this is a concern I have just generally for both a law enforcement approach and an adult protective services approach, that often we would prioritize a crime against person as being a higher rank significance than a crime, and this would be seen as a property crime. And for an older population, I think that division doesn't work very well, that it doesn't sort of indicate that the financial exploitation could be an early warning signal or completely wrapped up in the other types of abuse. And so, and then if you quantify that number, it can drop even lower. So it's just, I just wanted to throw that out as one of my concerns about how we sort of evaluate decision-making, and sort of, it becomes a relative measure on the seriousness, and I don't think it's accurate for this population. Let me go around one more time before we let this group go, if we have other questions from either end. Skip?
I have one question for Mr. Smoker. Have you seen, or are you aware of any particular training program for those employees in financial institutions that seem to be working? And are they restricted? Have you had the sense that they are restricted by the laws that may claim some basis for discrimination?
The training programs, yes, there are some very effective ones, and I'd be glad to get together offline, and I think we should, and kind of share what we know and what you are working on. The training programs per se don't really overlap the discrimination point per se. I think to some extent, though, they overlap the kind of confusion around, well, confusion in a few senses. To whom do you report this? Because there are so many options, right? Do you take it straight to law enforcement? Do you work through APS? Does that depend on what particular geography you happen to be in that is most effective? And even who is the right agency if you're going to take it to an agency? I mean, that's one of the struggles, as all of you know. The agencies vary in some cases by state, by region, by locality, et cetera, which is why we're very encouraged by the work you're doing on trying to gather all that information. And then it is the question of, trying to clarify and make it clear. And this doesn't, I mean, this will work for financial institutions, but it will work for a number of other industries as well, and just people in general. Make it clear that you have an obligation to report, and that if you do, you're held harmless, because there is a concern whether I'm an individual teller at a small institution. Should I say something? Shouldn't I? There's I think concern more broadly. So if we can clarify that, I think that would go a large way. And laws like Maryland has passed and like California has passed, as an example, don't just apply to financial institutions. They apply pretty much to any citizen who senses that there is an abuse going on, that you should report it, here's who to report it to, and that you're held harmless in reporting it. And so I think if we could get that, whether it has to be a national model that the states could adopt, or national legislation that applies and overrides the states, I mean, some model that basically helps that reporting to get improved. And one thing I wrote down earlier as the panel was talking, one thing that also struck me too is, and it's a point I just made a second ago, to whom do you report this? I mean, I think there are a lot of people who would report, but it is so confusing. And one idea I didn't have in either the written or the oral was, is there a way to think about kind of a 1-800 number, right? A one toll-free number that some call center then passes on. They have the information. I, as a citizen, or I as a teller, or I as whoever, don't need to think about or figure out that in my community I should probably call this number. I mean, is there a way to kind of consolidate that point of contact for somebody who wants to report?
I think that dovetails nicely with Mr. Greenwood's suggestion that, gee, wouldn't it be great if there were a database, if you
Right.
could have a single referral point that would collect standardized amounts of information and be able to go to that database and send it back.
Right.
I don't want to prolong much more, but I just had one final question. Our sense is that one of the challenges, one of the challenges that senior consumers and their caregivers face is access to adequate legal representation. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts or are aware of programs that are actually working to ensure that elderly consumers have the kind of access they need to get advice about the various legal issues they face. And Ms. Wood, I occurred maybe you might have some thoughts on
Well, as Kathy knows, under the Older Americans Act, there's a whole system of legal services programs for older people, and I think that functions very effectively, but it's not enough. And so combining that with private bar resources pro bono, and one of the things that the ABA does is work very hard to link those public and private pro bono and legal services programs so that you get more bang for your buck. But it's still not enough. And I think that there are a lot of avenues that we could take to increase that bear upon all the questions that we've just discussed.
Erica, you made a comment earlier about kind of going to the places where seniors are already engaged with the broader kind of aging and disability networks, and you were kind of listing a whole group. It's like, it's hard to find them. It's kind of a needle in the haystack. You've got such large numbers, but they do see other people. And when you were describing that, I just got stuck on how. I mean, operationalizing that particular idea, I'm just interested in now and as follow-up, so that if we have someone who comes in for services to a congregate meal site, we won't know they have a rep payee. I mean, how? Because it came up in the context of the abuse in the rep payee situation.
Yeah, and I guess you'd have to look at each of those players individually to see how they bump into the rep payees, but an ombudsman certainly might in the course of going to a facility. A legal services program might, and might not know about the indicators of rep payee abuse. So they each come in contact in a different way, but I agree that it's a very scattered approach. But even a simple brochure would help, because now most people have still not even really, it's not on the radar screen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anything else? Thank you, panelists. We will break for lunch. Before you move, let me tell, we can go ahead and clap, but I don't want them to move yet. Well, this is a federal event, so I'm proud to announce we won't be feeding you. We are good feds. We are going to break and reconvene here at 1:30. Lunch is on your own. Good luck, and thank you all very much. Please come back. We've got wonderful people speaking this afternoon, and thanks to the first panel so much.
Thank you.